A young girl vanished during what should have been a simple family holiday with her father and older brother. Back home, her mother was consumed by grief and a desperate search for answers. The prevailing assumption was abduction, but the true events remained shrouded in mystery. 10 years later, her older brother finally unveiled the chilling reality of what transpired on that fateful trip with their father. The stark fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed with a weary intensity in the late hours. Sarah Jenkins, a nurse of 43, felt the weight of each passing year pressing down on her, making her feel far older as she completed her charts at the nurse's station. Colleagues offered quiet goodnights as she gathered her belongings, her body moving with the practiced, almost automatic rhythm of someone who had just completed an 11-hour shift. "See you tomorrow, Sarah," a younger nurse called out cheerfully. "Bright and early," Sarah responded, though the prospect of starting her morning shift at the playgroup before returning to the hospital in the afternoon held little brightness. Yet, bills demanded payment, and single-handedly supporting a family, once three, now two, necessitated such sacrifices. The cool night air was a welcome sensation against her skin as she stepped outside, a stark contrast to the sterile warmth of the hospital interior. The bus, running late as usual, offered her mind an unwelcome opportunity to wander. 10 years. A decade had passed since her daughter, Emily, disappeared during that family vacation in Egypt. 10 long years filled with searching, pleading, and endless prayers. 10 years of watching her husband, David, slowly crumble, a mere shadow of his former self, drowning his guilt and pain in the oblivion of alcohol. 10 years of witnessing her son, Chris, grow up under the heavy pall of his sister's absence. When the bus finally arrived, Sarah found a seat by the window, resting her forehead against the cool glass as the suburban landscape blurred by. It was nearing 11 o'clock by the time she reached her stop. The darkened windows of her house spoke volumes. No one had waited up for her. The front door groaned open as she entered, the pervasive silence of the house immediately embracing her. She moved softly through the dimly lit living room, her nursing training lending a quiet deliberateness to her steps. Pausing at Chris's door, she gently pushed it inward, a thin shaft of hallway light illuminating his sleeping form. At 20, he still slept slightly curled on his side, a position he had favored since childhood. She resisted the maternal urge to brush the dark hair from his forehead, unwilling to disturb his rest. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Sarah placed her nursing bag on the dressing table, methodically unpacking her stethoscope, pens, and ID badge. The empty side of the bed held no surprise. David was out again, undoubtedly at one of his usual haunts. She sighed deeply, the profound weariness settling into her very bones. After a brief shower that did little to soothe her aching muscles, Sarah changed into worn, comfortable clothes. She checked her phone, typing a quick message to David. "Where are you?" "It's late." She knew, with a familiar certainty, that a reply was unlikely, but the routine of checking in had become an unbreakable habit. Settling at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom, Sarah opened her laptop. The screen's glow illuminated her tired face as she logged into her email, scanning for any new messages from the various missing persons forums and groups she had joined over the years. Most were frustratingly useless, spam, or well-intentioned tips that ultimately led nowhere. Still, she meticulously scrolled through each one, a nightly ritual she could not abandon. As she conducted her nightly search, a familiar guilt gnawed at her, a constant, unwelcome companion. If only she hadn't been working that day. If only she had joined them on that vacation from the beginning. Her second job as a playgroup teacher had been relatively new back then, taken on when David's military disability benefits had been reduced. The extra income was essential, and she had believed the vacation would be beneficial for David, a chance for him to reconnect with the children away from his escalating depression. His therapist had suggested it would be therapeutic, a chance to reset, and Sarah, desperate for any glimmer of hope, had agreed. Olivia, their family friend, had echoed the sentiment and was supposed to join them later that week, but a hospital emergency had prevented her. The cruel irony was not lost on Sarah. While she had been striving to save the lives of strangers in the emergency room, her own daughter had vanished without a trace. Sarah rubbed her throbbing temples, closing her eyes against the harsh glare of the screen. The burden she carried seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, defying the common assertion that grief would eventually lighten. She worked relentlessly, trying to provide some semblance of stability for the fragmented remains of her family. Although Chris had started working at the local supermarket, she insisted that he save his earnings for his future, unwilling to let their circumstances diminish her son's prospects. The sound of the front door opening downstairs jolted her from her thoughts. Heavy, uneven footsteps ascended the stairs, and moments later, David appeared in the doorway. His once handsome face was now puffy and marked by years of drinking. His military physique had long since softened. The pervasive smell of stale beer and cigarettes clung to him. Still at it, he slurred, gesturing toward the laptop. "Don't you ever give up?" Sarah partially closed the screen, bracing herself for the inevitable argument. "You're drunk again. So what if I am?" David leaned against the doorframe, his balance precarious. "You left Chris alone," she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. David scoffed. "He's 20, for Christ's sake, not child. He can manage to be home alone. Probably even likes the freedom. No one likes to be alone, David." Sarah stood, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the surge of frustration. "You're not working. The least you could do while I spend all my energy earning money for this family is spend some quality time with your son rather than wasting my hard-earned money on alcohol." "Here we go again." David rolled his eyes, a mocking smirk on his face. The martyr's speech. "If you'd saved all the money you've spent on beer over the years, I could probably afford to go to Egypt and search for Emily myself." David's expression darkened. "It's been 10 years, Sarah. 10 years. You won't find her even if you went there." "You're too drunk for this conversation," Sarah said, turning away from him. "You were probably drunk that evening, too, weren't you?" David's voice was laced with venom. "When Emily disappeared, it was your fault. You were there with her, and you didn't keep an eye on her." David's face contorted with sudden rage. "Don't you dare blame me. That girl just left the hotel and never came back. We were together spending the whole day at the beach, but she had to disappear by herself in the evening. Chris was there in the hotel, too, so I can't be the only one responsible. Chris was only 10. Sarah's voice rose, sharp and disbelieving. "You can't expect a child to keep an eye on his 8-year-old sister all the time." The argument escalated rapidly, each accusation fueled by a decade of unresolved grief and simmering resentment. Sarah felt her carefully constructed facade of control beginning to crumble under the combined weight of her exhaustion and David's aggressive belligerence. "I'm done with this," she finally declared, moving toward the door. "I'm sleeping downstairs tonight." But as she attempted to pass him, David's hand shot out, gripping her arm with painful force. "Don't you walk away from me," he growled, his eyes narrowed and hostile. "You will show me some respect." "Let go of me," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerously steady. "You don't deserve any respect for being a drunkard. I'm an ex-military man," David shouted, shoving her backward against the wall with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. He raised his hand, and Sarah flinched, instinctively bracing herself for a blow that never came. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Chris stood in the doorway of his downstairs bedroom, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light, a silent witness to the entire volatile confrontation. The moments stretched between them, taut with unspoken tension. Then David released her, storming into the bedroom and slamming the door shut behind him. The distinct click of the lock echoed in the sudden silence. Sarah leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to steady her ragged breathing before descending the stairs to her son. When she reached him, she wrapped her arms around him, her maternal instinct overwhelming her own distress. "I'm so sorry you had to see that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Chris's face was grim, his jaw set tight. "You can sleep in my bedroom tonight," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's big enough and I don't mind. I can sleep on the sofa." "No, sweetheart. You sleep in your room." I'll stay here in the living room. Sarah attempted a reassuring smile, though it felt fragile. I don't think I could sleep right now anyway. Chris frowned, his eyes filled with a worry that belied his years. I'm scared he might come after you again if he sees you sleeping on the sofa. Sarah looked at her son, no longer a boy but a young man burdened by experiences far beyond his age, and nodded slowly. Okay, thank you. Did he hit you? Chris asked quietly, his gaze searching her face for any hidden shame. No, Sarah assured him, gently touching his cheek. Everything is fine. How was your therapy session today? Chris shrugged, clearly reluctant to elaborate. Fine, same as always. Sarah followed him into his bedroom, suddenly acutely aware of how utterly exhausted she felt. You're right. I should sleep. I have a morning shift at the playgroup tomorrow and then the hospital in the afternoon. They exchanged goodnights, and Chris left to settle on the living room sofa. Rena closed the bedroom door and sank onto her son's bed, the familiar scent of his laundry detergent a comforting presence. As she lay in the darkness, her thoughts drifted to the drastic upheaval in their lives. David had been severely injured during his military deployment, a shrapnel injury to his right leg from an IED explosion resulting in partial loss of mobility and chronic nerve pain. He had endured multiple surgeries, including the insertion of a metal rod, which had depleted their savings and severely strained their finances. Compounding his physical injuries, he had been diagnosed with PTSD, which he consistently cited as the reason for his inability to work. Over the years, his condition had worsened, the lack of purpose and structure at home deepening his depression and reliance on alcohol. Sarah's tears silently wet the pillow as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her circumstances. A daughter lost, a husband broken, a son bearing invisible scars, and the crushing exhaustion of trying to hold it all together with increasingly frayed strength. Sarah jolted awake to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, disorientation held her captive. Then she recognized Chris's bedroom. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and felt her heart plummet as she saw the time. 10 o'clock. She had completely missed her morning shift at the playgroup. No, she muttered, sitting up too quickly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She checked her notifications, finding 3 missed calls and a message from Principal Thompson asking why she hadn't shown up or called in. Panic seized her as she scrambled out of bed. The playgroup class ran from 8 to 10:30, meaning she had missed the entire session. She quickly typed a reply to the principal, promising to come to the school in person to explain. Sarah hurried out of Chris's room and scanned the empty house. The sofa where Chris had slept was vacant, the blanket neatly folded. He must have already left for his supermarket job. She checked the master bedroom upstairs, finding it similarly deserted. There was no sign of David, though the lingering scent of stale alcohol remained. She changed into fresh clothes, skipping a shower to save time, and hurried to catch the bus to the school. Her mind raced with worry about her job security. Losing any income was a terrifying prospect, especially with David contributing nothing. As the bus approached the school, Sarah spotted Principal Thompson locking the gate. She rushed toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. Principal Thompson, I'm so sorry about this morning, she called out, her voice breathless. The principal turned, his expression a blend of concern and professional composure. Sarah, I was worried when you didn't show up. It's not like you to miss work without notice. I know, and I'm truly sorry, Sarah managed, trying to catch her breath. There was a situation at home last night, and I somehow slept through my alarm. Principal Thompson studied her face for a moment. You know, Sarah, I've been meaning to talk to you about your schedule, he said gently. Working 8 hours every evening at the hospital plus this morning job. And I know you pick up weekend shifts at that restaurant, too. It's just too much. I was wondering when something like this would happen. Sarah felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mingling with the fear of jeopardizing her position. I know it seems like a lot, but I can manage it, she said quickly. Today was just. Principal Thompson held up a hand. Tell you what, I won't count it against you this time. Consider a day off, but I want you to think about managing your schedule better. The children need a teacher who's alert and present. Relief washed over her, a palpable physical sensation. "Thank you, Principal Thompson," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I promise this won't happen again." As the principal got into his car and drove away, Sarah checked the time. She had several hours before her 2 p.m. shift to the hospital, an unexpected pocket of free time in her normally packed schedule. A sudden idea sparked in her mind. She could surprise Chris with lunch at his workplace. It had been ages since they had shared a meal without David's brooding presence casting a shadow. She headed toward the market area to pick up ingredients for a simple lunchbox, taking a moment to send Chris a text about her plan. As she walked, Sarah decided to take a shortcut through a series of alleyways that would significantly shorten her route to the market. The narrow passages were nearly empty in the late morning, the buildings on either side casting long, cool shadows. She was about halfway through when movement ahead caught her attention. From a distance, she saw a young man wearing bright yellow shoes and a black hoodie talking with a blonde woman dressed in minimal clothing despite the daytime hour. 2 men in black sunglasses and leather jackets stood nearby, their postures suggesting involvement in the conversation. Sarah slowed her pace, something about the young man's stance striking her as oddly familiar, even though his back was turned to her. She couldn't see his face, but those bright yellow shoes tugged at a memory she couldn't immediately place. The exchange looked like some kind of transaction, perhaps money or small packages changing hands, though she couldn't be certain from that distance. Suddenly, one of the men in leather jackets noticed her watching. He nudged his companion, and both men turned to stare directly at her. "What are you looking at, lady?" one of them shouted, his tone undeniably threatening. Sarah immediately turned around, her heart pounding as she quickened her steps back toward the main street. Her first instinct was to call the police, but what would she report? She hadn't gotten a clear view of what they were doing, and no one seemed to be in immediate danger. After the traumatic events of the previous night with David, she simply didn't feel she had the emotional fortitude to handle this potential threat to herself and Chris. As she emerged onto the bustling main street, Sarah tried to calm her racing nerves. Those bright yellow shoes continued to bother her. Where had she seen them before? The feeling of familiarity was undeniable, but she couldn't pinpoint the memory. Her appetite for shopping gone, Sarah pulled out her phone and texted Chris directly. "Would you like to have lunch together today? I have some free time before my shift." She waited for a reply, but none came immediately. Sighing, Sarah decided to head home. Perhaps she could use this unexpected free time to catch up on some chores or simply rest before her hospital shift. The house was quiet upon her return. Heading upstairs to the master bedroom, Sarah opened the windows wide to air out the lingering smell of alcohol. The room desperately needed a thorough cleaning, and she decided to start by changing the bedding. The king-size bed, a wedding gift from a wealthy friend 15 years prior, felt almost out of place in their otherwise modest home. Sarah stripped off the sheets and comforter, then attempted to move the heavy mattress to gain better access to the fitted sheet. As she pushed against it, straining with the effort, she braced one leg on the underbed for leverage. That's when she noticed something peculiar. A section in the middle of the underbed fabric looked distinctly different from the rest. Looking closer, she saw what appeared to be a seam where the material had been cut and then crudely sewn back together. "What in the world?" she murmured, running her fingers along the uneven stitching. Curiosity overriding her hesitation, Sarah retrieved a small pair of scissors from her sewing kit. She knew she might be damaging an expensive piece of furniture, but an irresistible compulsion urged her to investigate further. Carefully, she cut along the line of stitches, pulling back the fabric to reveal the cotton stuffing within. As she dug through the fluffy material, her fingers brushed against something smooth and flat. Pulling away more cotton, she discovered several photographs hidden within the underbed. With trembling hands, she extracted them one by one. The photos were from the family vacation in Egypt 10 years ago, the trip from which Emily had never returned. One photograph in particular seized her attention. David crouched on one knee on a sandy beach, Chris on his right, and Emily on his left. Both children were smiling, seemingly happy and carefree. Sarah turned the photo over and felt her breath catch in her throat. Written on the back were what appeared to be a set of coordinates. She quickly examined the other photos, which depicted various tourist sites around Egypt. On the back of a photo taken in the desert was what looked like a phone number, not in a U.S. format, likely an Egyptian number. Her heart pounding, Sarah used her phone to take pictures of the damaged underbed, documenting the hiding place. Then she hastily changed the bed cover and pushed the heavy mattress back into position. She didn't bother to sew the underbed back together, deciding it was a task for later. Taking the photographs to the desk, Sarah's mind reeled with questions. Why had David hidden these photos? What was the significance of these coordinates and the phone number? She picked up her phone and called Detective Miller, who had handled Emily's case from the beginning, but the call went straight to voicemail. She checked her messages and saw that Chris had finally replied, saying he would wait for her at the supermarket in an hour during his lunch break. Sarah quickly texted back, "Something's come up. I found a clue, but I'll see you there and tell you about it later." Turning to her laptop, Sarah typed the coordinates from the back of the beach photo into a search engine. The result pinpointed a location in the center of Gifton Island off the coast of Hurghada, Egypt. She compared the sandy beach in the photo to online images of Gifton Island beaches. They matched perfectly. Why would he mark this specific location? She whispered to herself. Was this just to remember where the photo was taken? Or is this where Emily is? The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. She looked at the phone number on the other photo, debating whether to call it. Curiosity ultimately won, and with trembling fingers, she dialed the international number. The line rang 3 times before a man answered, his voice speaking in heavily accented English. "Yes, who is this?" he inquired. Panic seized Sarah, and she immediately ended the call, nearly dropping her phone in her haste. She searched the number online, but found no relevant information. "What are you hiding, David?" she muttered, staring at the photos spread before her. With Detective Miller not answering her call, Sarah decided she needed to take these potential pieces of evidence to the police station herself. She carefully gathered the photographs, placed them in her handbag, and headed downstairs, her mind a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. As she reached for the front door, Sarah paused, checking the time. She should still have enough time to show these to the police and then meet Chris for lunch before her hospital shift. Sarah walked briskly toward the police station, the weight of the photographs in her bag feeling far heavier than their physical presence warranted. Her mind churned with questions and fragmented theories, each more disturbing than the last. About 15 minutes into her journey, she found herself passing the Rusty Anchor, a bar she knew David frequented. As if conjured by her thoughts, the door swung open, and David himself emerged, his face contorted in an expression of agitation. He stopped short when he saw her, genuine surprise registering in his bloodshot eyes. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he asked, glancing around suspiciously. "Thought you'd be at home, getting ready for work." Sarah's mouth went dry. She was completely unprepared for this confrontation, especially not here, not now. Her hand instinctively tightened on her bag, acutely aware of its incriminating contents. I'm going to visit Chris," she stammered, lying and avoiding his gaze. "We're planning to have lunch together." David narrowed his eyes, studying her face intently. "Oh yeah? You sure about that?" There was something deeply unsettling in his tone, a dangerous undercurrent that sent a shiver of apprehension down Sarah's spine. "Yes," she said, trying desperately to keep her voice steady. "I didn't get a chance to talk to Chris this morning. I overslept, so I thought I'd surprise him." David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I was just on my way home," he said, taking a step closer to her. "Why don't we have lunch together instead? Just the two of us. We can order delivery and eat at home before your shift." "I can't," Sarah said, taking a cautious step backward. "Not after what happened last night. I promise, Chris, he's waiting for me." Before she could finish, David's hand shot out, gripping her arm with painful intensity once again. "Chris will understand," he said, his voice low and controlled, devoid of any trace of warmth. "Come with me, Sarah." There was no request in his words, only an undeniable command. Sarah felt a surge of panic as David began to steer her back toward their house, his grip unyielding. She considered crying out to passers-by, but what could she say? That her husband wanted her to come home? It would sound utterly ridiculous, and the last thing she needed was a public scene that might draw unwanted attention and lead to questions about the photographs in her bag. As if reading her thoughts, David leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't make this difficult," he whispered. "Not here." They walked in tense silence, David's hand never leaving her arm. As they reached their house, David unlocked the door and practically shoved her inside before securing the deadbolt behind them. "David, what is this about?" Sarah demanded, rubbing her arm where his fingers had dug in. "Why did you lock the door?" "I need to go and meet Chris." Instead of answering, David advanced toward her with deliberate, measured steps. In one fluid motion, he yanked her handbag from her shoulder and emptied its contents onto the floor. Items scattered across the hardwood: her wallet, keys, phone, and the damning photographs from the underbed. Time seemed to slow as David bent down to retrieve the photos. His movements were almost casual, an unnerving calmness about him as he straightened, flipping through them before a hollow, unsettling laugh escaped him, echoing unnaturally in the silent house. "Man's right," he said, his voice unnervingly soft. "Seems like you found this." "What about those photos?" Sarah asked, backing away from him, her voice trembling. "I found them in the underbed," David finished for her, his eyes never leaving the photographs. "I know. I put them there." Sarah continued to back away until she felt the cold wall against her back. "How do you know?" she whispered. "And what's that coordinate? What's the phone number on the back?" David's smile sent a chill through her. "I think you've already figured it out, haven't you? Gifton Island. You always were thorough with your research." He held up the photos. "Someone I trusted on that island contacted me just now. Said a U.S. number called him. When he sent me the number, it was yours, Sarah." His eyes flickered to her phone lying on the floor. "That's how I know you found the photos. And I'm guessing you were on your way to the police station, not to see Chris." His gaze was sharp, accusatory. "If you're going to Chris, you would have taken the bus." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as David closed the distance between them. "What about that coordinate?" she pressed, desperate to keep him talking, to buy herself time. "Why hide the photos? What happened to Emily?" Instead of answering, David's hand shot out, wrapping cruelly around her throat. Sarah's eyes widened in shock as his fingers tightened, cutting off her air supply. She clawed at his hand, gasping desperately for breath. "Please," she choked out, the words barely audible. "I'm your wife. We still have a son." David's expression remained cold and unmoved by her desperate pleas. Sarah's vision began to blur at the edges as her lungs screamed for oxygen. Suddenly, her phone on the floor began to ring, its cheerful tone jarringly out of place in the grim moment. Sarah struggled to speak, her words barely a whisper. "It must be Chris. I promised lunch." The persistent ringing seemed to agitate David. His eyes darted to the phone, his grip on Sarah's throat momentarily loosening. Then, without warning, his face contorted, and he released her entirely, stumbling backward with his hands pressed against his ears. Sarah collapsed to her knees, coughing and gulping air into her starved lungs. She crawled toward her phone, but David recovered quickly. He lunged forward, snatching the phone just as she reached for it. He jabbed the end call button, silencing the insistent ringing. "No police," he growled, his breathing ragged. "No Chris. No one." Before Sarah could react, David grabbed her by the hair and dragged her toward the garage. From a drawer, he produced a zip tie and bound her wrists tightly, then used a shop rag to gag her. With surprising strength, he shoved her into the back seat of their old car, the vehicle they rarely used to save on gas. "I won't let you give that photo to the police," he muttered as he slammed the door shut. David climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, his movements jerky and erratic. As the garage door opened and the car reversed onto the street, Sarah's mind reeled with the horrifying realization that her husband, the father of her children, was capable of far worse than she had ever imagined. The drive was a disorienting blur for Sarah. With her hands bound and mouth gagged, She could only watch through the window as familiar neighborhoods gave way to parts of town she rarely visited. Eventually, David turned down a side street and parked behind a shabby-looking building with a flickering neon sign that read "The Last Call." The name sent a new wave of fear through Sarah that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't one of David's usual haunts. She had made it her business to know those places, had even gone to some to bring him home on particularly bad nights. This place was unknown territory, which could only mean he had deliberately kept it separate from his regular life. David cut the engine, the sudden silence pressing against Sarah's ears. He turned in his seat, studying her with a detached, chilling interest, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than his wife of 20 years. "We're going inside," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you try to signal anyone or make any noise, I'll tell them you're having a psychotic episode. Who do you think they'll believe? A decorated veteran or the overworked wife who's been obsessing over a decade-old disappearance?" The casual cruelty of the question stole what little fight remained in Sarah. She had spent years defending him to doctors, to friends, to Chris, insisting that beneath the layers of PTSD and alcoholism, the good man she had married still existed. Now, she wondered with a heavy heart if that man had ever truly existed at all. David exited the driver's side and circled to the rear door. When he opened it, daylight spilled across Sarah's face, temporarily blinding her after the dimness of the car interior. He grasped her arm, his fingers digging into the same bruises he had created earlier, and pulled her from the vehicle. "Don't make a scene," he warned, his breath hot against her ear. The smell of whiskey and something medicinal, perhaps the pills he claimed never to take, made her stomach clench. David guided her through a back entrance, his grip painful on her bound arms. The interior was dimly lit, the stale smell of cigarettes and cheap liquor hanging heavily in the air. Despite the early hour, several men sat at a worn bar, while others lounged in booths along the walls. They barely looked up as David entered with his bound wife, suggesting this wasn't the first unusual sight they had witnessed here. A tall man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos adorning his neck approached them. He wore an expensive watch that seemed oddly out of place in the dingy surroundings. "David," he acknowledged with a nod, his eyes assessing Sarah coldly. "This is her." "I've had enough of this woman," David declared, pushing Sarah forward slightly. "Deal with her quick and no mess." Sarah's eyes widened as a terrifying understanding crashed over her. This wasn't just about preventing her from going to the police. David intended for her to disappear permanently. She tried to scream through the gag, the sound emerging as a muffled whimper that drew no attention from the other patrons. The tattooed man, Marcus, took hold of her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle compared to David's bruising force. His fingertips were calloused, his palms warm and dry against her clammy skin. "Take her to the back," a heavy-set man called from behind the bar, his focus never leaving the glass he was polishing with a dingy rag. As Marcus guided her away, Sarah twisted her head back, desperate for one last look at David. She saw another man approach him, leaning in close to ask, "You want the usual girl?" David's response floated clearly across the room, his voice lighter now that the burden of her presence was being removed. "Yes, with something to take my mind off all this." He reached into his jacket, producing a thick envelope that he handed to the bartender with practiced ease. The man peered inside, whistling low at the contents before tucking it beneath the counter. "What a good use of your wife's money," the man laughed, a cynical sound. "You sure you want to get rid of her? You're losing your ATM." "Don't ask, just do it," David snapped, already turning toward a doorway on the opposite side of the room where a young blonde woman in a tight dress waited, her expression vacant. Marcus guided Sarah down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room containing only a metal chair and a cabinet. He pushed her into the chair and secured her legs with more zip ties, working quickly and efficiently. Despite her terror, Sarah studied his face carefully, determined that if by some miracle she survived this, she would be able to identify him to the police. As he straightened to his full height, recognition struck her like lightning. This was one of the men in leather jackets she had seen earlier that day in the alley, during her shortcut to the market. But who was the young man wearing the bright yellow shoes? Certainly not David. Once she was securely bound to the chair, Marcus straightened and looked directly into her eyes for the first time. What she saw there confused her. Not the cold detachment of a killer for hire, but something softer, almost apologetic. His expression shifted, the hardness melting from his features as he pressed a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. From his pocket, he withdrew a smartphone. Its screen was cracked at one corner, but the display remained bright in the dim room. After tapping the screen several times, he turned it to show her. On the display was a banking app showing a transaction record with an amount that made Sarah's eyes widen in shock. Easily 5 figures, more money than she could save in a year of double shifts. But it was the name on the transaction that truly stole her breath. Chris Marlowe, her son. He had paid this man. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, forming a picture she desperately did not want to believe. The bright yellow shoes, of course, they were Chris's. That's why they had felt so achingly familiar. As the devastating realization settled over her like a leaden blanket, Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, not for herself, but for her son. What had David done to drive Chris to such desperate, unthinkable measures? And what would become of her boy if this plan succeeded? Marcus switched off his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. He moved to the cabinet against the wall, his movements deliberate as he extracted a key from around his neck and unlocked the metal doors. Inside, mounted on hooks and organized with chilling military precision, was an arsenal that made Sarah's blood run cold. Handguns of various calibers, boxes of ammunition stacked neatly, and what appeared to be a disassembled rifle on the bottom shelf. The man selected a revolver, its blue-black finish absorbing what little light reached it. With practiced movements, he opened the cylinder, showing Sarah that it contained a single bullet. He spun the cylinder, the metallic clicks echoing in the small room like a macabre countdown. "1 bullet," he said quietly. "For your husband." From Chris. Sarah shook her head frantically, making muffled sounds of protest behind her gag. Her eyes pleaded with Marcus, trying to communicate what her voice could not. "Don't do this. Not in my son's name." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened. Chris stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He wore jeans and a hoodie, and on his feet were the bright yellow shoes Sarah had glimpsed in the alley earlier that day. "Mom," he breathed, his voice cracking on the single syllable. He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees beside the chair. His fingers, trembling slightly, worked at the knot of the gag. The cloth fell away, and Sarah gasped as fresh air touched her dry mouth. "I'm so sorry they had to restrain you like this," Chris said, not meeting her eyes as he began working on the zip ties binding her wrists. "It's just to make sure you wouldn't fight back and ruin the plan. I didn't want that, but Marcus insisted it was necessary." Marcus gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "I'm also sorry for what I'm about to do," Chris continued, his voice dropping to a whisper filled with pain. "But I can't let him hurt you again. If he brought you here, that means only one thing. He wanted to get rid of you permanently." As blood rushed painfully back into her freed hands, Sarah grabbed Chris's arm, her grip tight. "No," she said hoarsely. "Chris, listen to me. If the police find out about this, they'll put you in prison. You can't do this." Chris's face hardened, a mask of grim determination. "I don't care. After everything Dad did, I just want him gone." "What do you mean?" Sarah searched her son's face, bewildered. "Chris, what are you talking about?" "The truth is too painful, Mom," Chris whispered, his eyes haunted by unseen horrors. Marcus, who had been standing by silently, his presence almost forgotten in the intense moment between mother and son, stepped forward. "Your dad's upstairs with that woman," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now's the right time if we're going to do this." Chris nodded, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of youth. He reached for the gun in Marcus's hand, his expression set with a terrible, unwavering determination. In that moment, time seemed to slow for Sarah. She saw her son, her beautiful, sensitive boy, who had once refused to step on ants and had cried when his sister's tooth fell out, reaching for a weapon with the intention of becoming a killer. In his face, she saw not just hatred for his father, but the reflection of a lifetime of pain she had somehow failed to shield him from. The devastating realization galvanized her. Moving faster than either man anticipated, Sarah lunged toward Chris, her muscles protesting after their confinement. Her fingers closed around his phone, which was protruding slightly from his hoodie pocket. "Mom, what?" Chris began, but Sarah had already pressed the SOS button, the one they had configured years ago after Emily's disappearance. A feature that automatically dialed 911 and sent the phone's location to emergency services. "No!" Chris shouted, trying to grab the phone back. The device began its connection sequence, a calm female voice announcing, "Emergency services have been contacted. Please stay on the line." Marcus cursed loudly. "Deal's off," he declared, quickly unloading the gun and shoving it back into the cabinet. "I don't do murder with cops on the way." He gestured to someone outside the door, and within seconds, he and his men were rushing out of the building. Chris stared at Sarah, his expression a mixture of anger and profound devastation. "Why did you do that?" "He was going to pay. I wanted to end this." Sarah held her son's face between her hands, her thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "I can't let you become a criminal, Chris," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've already lost one child. I can't lose you two." Chris's eyes welled with tears, the tough facade crumbling to reveal the wounded boy beneath. "But as long as he's alive, we'll never be safe," he whispered. "You'll never be safe. I saw what he did to you last night. I've seen what he's capable of for years." "Listen to me," Sarah said urgently, hearing the distant wail of sirens growing closer. "This stays between us. We tell the police we caught your father here using drugs. I'll show them the evidence I found, and you'll tell them everything that happened in Egypt, but you never paid anyone to harm your father. Do you understand me?" Chris hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. "But what if he tells them? What if those men talk?" "They won't," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "They're long gone, and Marcus doesn't seem the type to confess to conspiracy charges." She squeezed his hands. "And who would believe David over us? He's been threatening and abusing us for years." Chris nodded slowly, looking suddenly young and vulnerable again. "Okay," he whispered. "Good," Sarah said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "Now, help me clean this place. We need to wipe down everything you and I touched." Together, they quickly used their sleeves to wipe down the chair, the doorknob, and the cabinet handles, anywhere fingerprints might have been left. As the sirens grew louder, Sarah studied her son's profile, seeing both the child he had been and the man he was becoming. Despite everything they had endured, she felt a surge of fierce, protective pride, not for the desperate plan he had conceived, but for the profound love that had driven it. Chris had been willing to sacrifice his freedom, his future, perhaps even his soul, to protect her. Police cars screeched to a halt outside the building, their lights casting urgent red and blue shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. "Remember," she whispered, her voice firm. "You were trying to save me, nothing more." Sarah and Chris stepped out of the pub just as police cars pulled up, their lights flashing against the building's grime. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, approaching cautiously. "My husband is inside," Sarah called out, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "Upstairs. He brought me here against my will." The officers approached, one of them holstering his weapon to speak with them while the others entered the building. "Ma'am, we receive an emergency call from this location. Can you tell me what happened?" he asked, his tone professional but kind. Sarah nodded, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging within her. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. My husband, David Jenkins, abducted me from our home and brought me here. I believe he intended to have me killed." As she spoke, more officers emerged from the building, escorting David and a scantily clad woman. David's face contorted with rage when he saw Sarah and Chris standing with the police. "This is a setup," he shouted, struggling against the officer's grip. "They're lying. Whatever they told you is a lie." The officer interviewing Sarah ignored David's outburst. "We'll need both of you to come to the station to give formal statements," he said. Sarah reached into her pocket, producing the photographs she had managed to grab before being forced from the house. "Officer, I found these hidden in our home today," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They're from our family vacation in Egypt 10 years ago, the trip where my daughter disappeared." The officer examined the photos, noting the coordinates and phone number written on the backs. "We'll take these as evidence," he said, placing them carefully in an evidence bag. Chris stepped forward, his voice unexpectedly firm and clear. "I was there," he said. "I was 10 years old when my father murdered my sister. He's been threatening and abusing me ever since to keep me quiet." Without warning, Chris lifted his shirt, revealing a disturbing pattern of old scars across his back, stark evidence of systematic abuse that made Sarah gasp in horror. She had never seen these marks before. Chris had always been careful to change privately, even at home. "Oh, Chris," she whispered, reaching for him, her heart aching with a pain deeper than any physical injury. As David was being placed in a police car, he locked eyes with Chris, a malevolent glare in his eyes. "You think you're smarter than me?" he called out, his voice hoarse with fury. "No, I'll make sure you end up behind bars, too." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "This is a war zone now, and I'll defeat all my enemies." He spat toward them before being forced into the car, his final act of defiance making Sarah flinch. She watched as the man she had married, the father of her children, transformed before her eyes into someone utterly unrecognizable, a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for years. At the police station, David and the woman were processed through booking while Sarah and Chris were taken to separate interview rooms. Detective Miller, who had worked Emily's case from the beginning, joined Sarah with a folder of notes. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his expression grave and sympathetic, "I apologize for missing your call earlier. Tell me everything that happened today." Sarah recounted finding the photographs, the coordinates to Gifton Island, and the phone number she believed belonged to someone David had paid to cover up Emily's death. She described David's violent reaction when he discovered she had found the photos, his abduction of her, and bringing her to the pub. "I believe he killed her based on what he implied in Chris's statement," she concluded, her voice breaking with emotion. "I think Emily is buried somewhere on that island, and David paid someone to protect that terrible secret." Detective Miller nodded solemnly, making notes. "We'll coordinate with Egyptian authorities immediately," he said. "That phone number may lead us to whoever helped your husband." He paused, studying her face intently. "What I need to understand is how you ended up at that pub. And if your husband had paid those men to kill you, why hadn't they done so before we arrived? And how did your son know where to find you?" Sarah carefully explained her version of events, strategically omitting Chris's involvement with the men. "Chris and I were supposed to have lunch together," she said. "He called me during my struggle with David, but the call ended abruptly. He must have suspected I was in danger. We have a family tracker app on our phones that we installed years ago when Emily disappeared. We rarely use it now, but it was still active." Detective Miller frowned, continuing to write in his notebook. "Something still doesn't add up, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his gaze steady. "I need you to tell me the whole truth." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the door. Another detective entered, his expression serious. "Chris Jenkins has confessed everything," he announced quietly. "He claims he knew his father had paid those men for prostitutes and potentially to kill his mother if she discovered the truth about what happened 10 years ago." The detective continued, his voice flat. "According to your son, he paid those men a higher price than his father, without David's knowledge. He asked him to kill David while he was with a woman because he didn't want him to hurt you anymore. He said he'd already lost his sister and couldn't bear to lose his mother, too." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. "No, he also said you stopped him because you didn't want him to become a murderer," the detective added. "The men apparently got away before we arrived." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized Chris had chosen to tell the complete truth, not protecting himself as she had desperately instructed. "Chris also told us what happened 10 years ago," the detective added gently. "According to him, your husband had been abusing both children for years. The abuse continued until today. David never took the medications prescribed for his PTSD and was drinking heavily, which you partially knew about, but you were working most of the time and weren't home much. You trusted him and never suspected the extent of the abuse. Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears, the weight of her unintended ignorance crushing her. I should have known, she whispered. I should have seen the signs. Your son claims that on the day Emily disappeared, David had been drinking at a hotel bar. The detective continued. He returned to their room, took Emily with him, and when he came back later that night, Emily was gone. He threatened Chris, saying if he ever told anyone, he would hurt both Chris and you. Detective Miller reached across the table, his voice gentle and compassionate. We'll coordinate with Egyptian authorities to find the man David paid, he said. That person is likely the key to finding out exactly what happened to Emily. Whatever happened to her, Sarah whispered, her voice raw with pain. I just hope her soul is at peace now and that David will receive the punishment he deserves. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, but filled with a newfound determination. What about my son? What will happen to him? He'll be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, Detective Miller said frankly, not softening the blow. But given the circumstances, the court might show leniency. The fact that he stopped short of actually committing the crime will work in his favor. Sarah straightened, finding a new reserve of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I've lived a bitter life for the past decade, she said, her voice clear and firm. But I'll plead with the judge for my son. He didn't go through with killing his father. He chose to be better despite everything he's endured. Detective Miller nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. That's fair, he said. I hope justice will be served for all of you. He stood. For now, we'll continue the investigation. Please wait outside while we process everything. Sarah walked into the corridor, emotionally exhausted but resolute. Through a doorway, she saw Chris being processed by an officer, his hands cuffed in front of him. Their eyes met across the room, hers filled with sorrow and a mother's unwavering love, his with a strange sort of peace, as if a terrible burden had finally been lifted. When the booking process was complete, an officer allowed Sarah a brief moment with her son before they took him to a holding cell. I'm so sorry, Mom, Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes still holding that newfound peace. Sarah touched his face gently, a gesture of comfort and profound gratitude. Thank you for saving my life, she said, her voice thick with emotion. If you hadn't intervened, we'd all just be counting days until we ended up in the graves David had prepared for us. I couldn't let him hurt you anymore, Chris said simply, the depth of his love a powerful force. Listen to me, Sarah said firmly, her gaze unwavering. You didn't kill your father. You're not a murderer. And whatever he or anyone else says against you in court, I will believe you and testify for you. We're going to get through this, Chris, together. As the officer led Chris away, Sarah watched her son, his back straight, his head held high. Despite everything they had endured, Emily's disappearance, David's cruelty, and the crushing weight of years of secrets, they had survived. The truth, painful and devastating as it was, had finally come to light. For the first time in 10 years, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of finding Emily alive, but a quiet, steady hope that justice would ultimately prevail, that evil would be punished, and that she and Chris might eventually find a measure of peace. Whatever lay ahead, trials, investigations, painful revelations, they would face it together, bound by a love that had endured the darkest of nights. The long night of secrecy and suffering was finally giving way to the first pale, hesitant light of truth. Thank you for reading this story. If you found it compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories like this.